Fountainhead Forum 5. This is Roy. I'm talking with Roy Barzilai. I'm Chris Baker, and he will be discussing men's issues in the modern world today and other topics like objectivism as well. How you doing, Roy?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay, and you're from Israel. You're my first guest from Israel. It's evening there, but it's about lunchtime here. But let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your three books?
Yes, sure. I my background is in finance and economics. I worked as a financial analyst for over a decade, since the year about 2000. For the last 20 years, and I've been interested in financial cycles, historical economic cycles. And over the recent decade, but particularly since the crisis in 2008, I became more interested in philosophy, economics. I started to uncover deeper layers of the mystery of our society, our civilization, and the cycles of that governs our world. So went into objectivism, studied philosophy. Then went even into hormones because I saw there's a sexual component to the life cycles. Like the culture is changing from a masculine one to a more feminine one, and that's coincide with the fall of. I see it's coinciding with the fall of capitalism into socialism. And then I dug deeper, and I went even to study neuroscience a little bit, evolutionary psychology. So it's a synthesis of many different scientific genres, and I wrote three books. I published in 2014 my first book, The Objective Bible, in which I studied, is a result of my study of objectivism, of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and also the philosophy, Western philosophy in general, Christianity, Judaism, the entire 4,000 years of Western civilization and philosophy. Then in 2015, I published the testosterone hypothesis, which is concerned with how testosterone sex hormones regulate the life cycles of civilization, like the fall of the Roman Empire, which I attribute to the decline in testosterone levels. And my third book was published in 2018. It's called Sex Wars: How Hormones Drive Gender, Race, and Culture Conflicts. And this is a further development of the testosterone worldview, which states that what we are currently seeing in the degeneration of, as I see, the degeneration of decline of Western civilization is caused by decline in sex and growth hormones, which is also associated with solar cycles that affect our climate, that cause what we have, like in 2020, the pandemic hysteria, that causes economic collapse, and then sex wars like for empire. Now we see the Russian, Chinese, and Iran joining together. I call it the new Mongol Empire in the East against the West. And this is a pattern that repeats, I found, every 7 centuries. Like there was in the 14th century, the Mongol Empire and the Black Plague. If you take it 7th century before that, was the fall of the Roman Empire in the 7th century, and then there was the rise of the Islamic Caliphate with its sex wars by Muhammad. And even if you take it 7 centuries earlier, then you see the rise of the Roman Empire and the fall of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and so on and so on. I go even back to the Sumerian civilization before the Judaism even. So I found very interesting patterns which I unite in a unique synthesis of solar cycles, sex hormones, history, evolution, biology, everything. It's a complex theory. And I published 4 academic articles in science and philosophy academic science journals, peer-reviewed science journals in Italy. Now I submitted a new article to Science Journal in the US, a premier one. I don't know if it will be accepted because my theory is very new and revolutionary, but it's being studied in academic circles. And I believe in due time it will be made more popular because it takes time to bring new ideas to the public and to academia. So this has been my journey into this area of science and philosophy and my new theory I created.
Yeah. You mentioned you got into Ayn Rand when you were in your finance career. How old were you?
How old I was then?
Yes.
I started studying Ayn Rand, I think, about a decade ago, even a little bit. I was 38.
I just,
Um,
yeah, that's quite unusual. You hear people starting with Ayn Rand usually in their teens, or in my case, 21. So I just thought I thought I'd look at that. It's very interesting because you probably didn't have the emotional reaction to Rand, but I've noticed that people who get into Rand later seem to be a little more reasonable than the ones who get into it at a teenage. What was your first Rand book, by the way?
Actually, I was interested in her philosophy, not in her romance books. I didn't read them. I'm more interested in philosophy and science. So I love her. I read all of her philosophy books and Peikoff, her and other objectivist philosophers. I'm very interested in philosophy,
Oh,
but actually, I didn't read the romance books like the
okay,
Fountainhead.
okay, that's cool. Yeah. So this is a very interesting hypothesis, I think, because of what's been going on with the sex wars right now, uh, and what Rollo Tomasi calls the gynocentric social order that we have now. And I don't know. I'm curious to know about what's going on in Israel. And I know Israel is an unusual case because Israel is the one Western country that still has a high birth rate. I mean, you look at Europe, it's well under two. Well, you look at Russia and China for that matter; they're well under two. But I know Israel still has a birth rate that's very, very much more than needed for replacement. You got any theories on that, or what's your explanation of that?
Well, I have two theories about that. One is we have the ultra-Orthodox community, the Hasidic Jewish, and they have a very high birth rate, about 8 children per family. And we have the Zionist religious Jews. You know, Israel's population is very fragmented. So we have like the religious Jews and the secular, and they fight between each other. The liberals, conservatives, similar to the U.S. But so the religious community has a high birth rate. Even the Zionist religious Jews, because the Hasidic, like the Orthodox, some of them are anti-Zionist. It's very difficult to explain everything. But even the secular Jews have above 2 children. I think even something like 3 children. But so the culture here is pretty pro-family. Even today, when you have a lot of feminism here as well and sex wars here, but still there is a very strong family culture because I think it's the foundation of Judaism. Jewish culture over thousands of years has been on family values. So it's difficult to destroy this culture. This is what held the Israeli people over millennia. And you can read it in Genesis 1. God commands to be fruitful and multiply. So I think it's the foundations that are strong. Also, I think the location of Israel is in the more comparing to Europe is more southern, is closer, is a more hot region, not as cold as Europe. And if you look, we are even close to Africa. Like Egypt is in Africa, has very high birth rates in Egypt, and in Africa is the peak birth rates today of the world are in Africa, while Europe and China are in great decline in fertility rates in population. So I think it has to be with climate as well, because we have a more exposure to the sun. We are closer to the equator. My theory concerns solar cycles, how they affect sex hormones. So if you get more light, you will get higher testosterone levels and you are more sexually active, like the summer mating season. Like you see in Europe, there are scientific research about that. Like in Finland, in the beginning of summer, or like in the April, when you have the spring, fertility rates go up like 40% in Finland, in the northern countries. Like in Denmark, the government was very concerned with the lower birth rates. So they had this publicity for couples to go to a summer holiday and have sex, have kids, you know. So the
Yes.
summer is. So I think we have more summer for sure, more than Europe. So I think the northern hemisphere, where you have like United States, Europe, China, are more affected by low solar activity due and now the solar activity is very reduced. It's been going down since the 1950s. And then if you look in 1950s, where was peak fertility rates in the world. In
Yes.
the US in 1950s, I think was about 2.5 children per woman.
Yes.
And you have also the published capitalist philosophy of Ayn Rand in the 1950s. 1957, she published not the Fountainhead, but her
Atlas Shrugged.
Atlas Shrugged,
Yeah, Fountainhead was
which
43.
43 years. So Atlas Shrugged. So if you look at the solar cycle, it bottomed in 1933, which caused the Great Depression, because when you have low solar activity, you got low testosterone, people are more stressful, like today, and then you get the sex wars, the Nazis, the communists, the feminists were in the 1920s, and you get a Great Depression like we have today. That's because testosterone is low, and the stress hormone cortisol is rising. And you had the pandemic, even going back to 1918, the Spanish flu. So we have similar circumstances today, since solar activity has been declining for the past 70 years. But
Yes.
if you look in warm countries like Africa, I think because they have more sun. Like if you go in Egypt in the desert, it's more sun. But even if you compare Islamic countries, in Egypt is a much higher birth rate than in Turkey or Iran. Iran is collapsing and Turkey is collapsing, while in Egypt and Saudi Arabia is still very high. So why is that? I think because of the climate, they're closer to hotter climates, closer to the equator.
Do you think it might just be, in some places you have people who are spending 8 hours a day outside working on the farm, and in America or Europe you have people spending 8 hours a day sitting in the office?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, also, when you work on the farm, like more agricultural communities, you have lower population densities. You need more masculine men to do the hard work. So if you have muscles, will be more attractive to women. But if you are in a city environment where it's industrialized, everything, you don't need strong men. You can be a women or men don't have no much difference. That's like you see the starting of the metrosexual, sex in the city environment, the interchangeable sex. So I think, and if you look at voting patterns, agricultural communities tend to vote much more conservative than, like the rural communities are more conservative, more masculine than the metropolitan areas like New York or LA.
Yes. Yeah, I even hear some men talk about ways to increase their own testosterone levels literally by shining infrared light, between their legs, just to get
Yeah.
some of that down there, and that apparently does raise testosterone levels, because it's certainly something you hear men talk about, as especially as they get older, because testosterone levels are supposed to drop. I don't know if there's a way, if science will come up with a way to increase testosterone levels, but it's certainly
We already have the way. The problem is not science, is that we don't have the will, because the
yeah,
academia today is controlled by radical feminists and they are not interested in increasing testosterone, even though they are all on antidepressants, which have major side
yeah,
effects and cause depression actually in long term,
yeah.
like drugs, but they're anti-testosterone. So there's a big problem with the culture, and men today are very negligible in academia.
Yes, and I've also. What do you think about? I know there are also some theories, for example, about estrogenics getting in the water and things like that. Have you looked into that any, or?
Yes, absolutely. There is effect of industrial plastics and all that, but I don't think it's the major effect. I think the major effect is the sun affecting climate and solar patterns. It's causing pandemics. Like you see, the pandemics causes more stress, like we had in 2020, the coronavirus hysteria, and stress reduces testosterone. There are many medical studies about that, because when you need a strong immune response, and women have a much more stronger immune response. That's why women get 80% of autoimmune diseases when the body attacks itself by mistake, and that causes illness. And our society is attacking itself from within. I published a scientific article about that, about sex differences in immune response and the coronavirus hysteria in 2020. And that's also causing, I think, global wars. The war now between Russia and Ukraine, beginning of World War III, always come in these periods of low testosterone and pandemics, and we start wars because if you look at the origin of sex, it's actually, there's a theory about that. It's called the Red Queen hypothesis. Because why do we need sex at all? It takes a lot of energy and effort to reproduce this way. I mean, the egg can just reproduce asexually. So what happens is you need sex to mix the genes between different population groups. And then you get the race wars and the gender wars going on because when you have pandemics, it makes sense to mix the genes to get more differentiation in the DNA so you can better combat pandemics. And there are studies about that in fish populations that have sex versus those fish that are asexual, and those that are sexual do much better immunologically when confronted with pandemics and parasites. So I think that's what's causing now the global world. We're heading into World War III. I think that's what I mean because of this area. It's all interconnected. The environmental side, the biological, even testosterone affects philosophy. As I say, in the 1950s was philosophy of capitalism with Ayn Rand. And the ideal is the masculine, strong man, the Atlas, the god Atlas, who holds the globe on his shoulders, strong masculine man. And if you look at Ayn Rand, for example, she was very radical, anti-feminist, pro-capitalist. So it all meshes together. You just have to understand this. How this synthesis works is
Yes.
complex. It takes many years, and unfortunately, I seem to be the only one who is interested in studying this today.
Yes, I do think Rand was almost a male supremacist. As much as the left attacks Rand, I'm surprised that they never attack her for that. But yeah, the hypothesis of World War III ties into what Jordan Peterson likes to say is do not fear strong men, but fear weak men. And we have a lot of weak men who have gotten into these positions of authority. I mean, somebody like Trudeau in Canada, or well, Biden, of course, but Biden also basically has all. Biden also isn't in very good health to begin with, and some of these other people, and you look also at some of the worst corona tyrants in the world are female. Uh,
Right.
Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, or Merkel in Germany, or some of these others. So it does make me wonder, especially seeing the way everybody just say, "Oh, run and hide from the big bad virus," and it kills, what mostly people who are over the median age. So it definitely. So you think we definitely will have a war here? Though, how much do you think the factor is though in culture? Because I mean, Putin is still uh, Putin still seems to endorse a society where men and women are different, whereas America has went down the path of we don't even know what bathroom to use.
Right. As Putin says, the liberalism is eating itself from within, so it's self-destructing. I think because the West had higher testosterone during the Enlightenment. If you look at the word in the term enlightenment, it means from light. Is opposite of darkness. Yeah. And so if you look at the solar patterns of the sunspots, you can see that during the 18th century Enlightenment, solar activity peaked in 1776, and that led to the rebellion of the founding fathers to create the United States against the British Empire. The ideal was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's opposed to the 1930s. You had the culture of death, the Nazis, the communists, and the Great Depression, which depression is opposed to happiness. Yeah. So I think it's all associated with solar cycles, and also the period of the Spanish flu pandemic during World War One was in 1918. Was also the period of the Russian Soviet Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany was formed in 1919 by Ernst Röhm and Adolf Hitler later joining.
Yes.
So we have a history as a cyclical pattern similar to seasonal patterns. and in period of darkness, like you see in Game of Thrones. If you like to see the future, watch the popular culture, like you see Game of Thrones, or the kind of movies people see today are very dark themes, like middle age. The Game of Thrones. What is the slogan? Winter is coming. So that's true. Winter is actually coming. We are already entering deep into winter because of solar activity in low, and then you get the pandemics and the wars, like in the Middle Ages. When you have a sunny outlook, happy outlook, like in the Enlightenment, then you get the Age of Reason, industrial evolution, and of course needs a lot of energy. And then you have high testosterone, high sexual drive, because testosterone also shapes our brain. And you get higher dopamine because men have higher dopamine. There's a scientific research about that. And I read a book about that by a neuroscientist. His name is Professor Pavik. It's called The Dopaminergic Mind Throughout History and Evolution. And he actually shows that great scientists were highly dopaminergic, is more attributed to men, that high testosterone causes high dopamine. And dopamine is an exploratory neurotransmitter that causes you to seek patterns of order and create and be more exploratory and seeking, like the age of exploration, starting from the Renaissance and Columbus discovering America, and then you get the scientific evolution, the industrial evolution, the Enlightenment. But now we are in the opposite state where testosterone, dopamine, serotonin are all declining because of the low solar activity, and the sex and the stress hormones are rising. So there's more conflict. People are very stressed, depressed. It's called high stress society. Stressed out. People all know in the big cities you are stressed out, and so we are in a degeneration pattern. And even if you look in a neurotransmitter like serotonin, which people do not know how importantly it is connected to solar patterns, because in the morning when you rise up, your testosterone and serotonin rise, and in the evening they fall, and serotonin is transformed into melatonin, the sleep hormone, and that causes you to fall asleep during the night. So I think we are lacking in a scientific synthesis. We are very, very small-minded, I think, when we look at the world with reductionist view. So we lack this synthesis, and unfortunately, I don't see many people are interested in science today.
Yes, I wonder, have you found a connection between older parents and lower testosterone? I mean, obviously, a 21-year-old father has higher testosterone than a 35-year-old father. Is there a connection there, possibly, that because of a lower testosterone father, he'll have lower testosterone kids?
That might be. I haven't seen any studies about that, but it could be. I mean, women, it's known that if they have more children, the older children tend to be have less testosterone, I think, or they can be more homosexual or something like that, because in the pregnancy, testosterone rises after 6 weeks of pregnancy. So if testosterone doesn't rise in the womb, after 6 weeks, there's higher chances, I think, that the child will be more feminine or even homosexual, I think, something like that. I read articles about that. So it's connected, yes. The very important this period of the fetus, testosterone exposure up to during pregnancy, even after, I think, during the first year. There's a very famous professor, Baron Cohen, in England, in Cambridge. He studies the influence of testosterone on fetuses and how it causes autism. And the sex, even Jordan Peterson talks about his work.
So higher testosterone exposure can cause more feminine characteristics in males. Is that what you're saying?
No, opposite. I
Oh,
mean, I think older mothers are more stressed because they are not as young as healthy.
Oh,
So they have higher stress hormones. Like if there's also a book about I forgot his name. Is a Dutch neuroscientist. He found out that women who smoke, they have lower the fetus can become homosexual because then he has lower testosterone because of the stress. So he can become homosexual if the mother is smoking. It's very interesting in the developmental of the brain,
yes.
how testosterone is affected. There are very important periods during fetus development, and the second is during puberty that affect testosterone and sexual development.
Yes. What can happen during puberty?
Well, I think we can see today that we have a lot of transgenderism because of low testosterone and serotonin. I think is transgenderism, all this LGBTQ stuff. It's similar to entropy because actually sex is very similar to electromagnetism because you have the plus minus male female yin yang sexual attraction is electromagnetic because it's affected by solar patterns and the light affects our sex hormones. So psychologists research found that testosterone affects heterosexual attraction between male and female. So when you have higher testosterone in a male, he's more attracted to a more feminine face. They studied in faces, and women that have healthy testosterone levels would be more attracted to masculine men. So opposite sex attraction is actually determined by testosterone and serotonin levels. So now when we have low testosterone and serotonin levels, people become more transgender and homosexual and lesbian. That's the reason. But nobody is allowed
Yes.
to talk about sex hormones. They say it's all social, it's not
Yeah.
biological anymore. So
Do you think there's a way that our that we detect someone else's serotonin levels or testosterone levels or
yes, you can see it in the face, more
yeah,
facial, and also the fingers. There is something I don't remember how it's called, but they
the
can
fingers, yes.
scientists know how to find it.
Yeah.
Psychologists know.
This is all very interesting. Of course, with kids, playing more video games instead of playing outside, I wonder how that would impact their testosterone levels as well. It's so apparently you're also talking about testosterone levels in women, although that's not really nearly as high because women have different hormones, obviously. But yes, but so
Yeah, it's much lower. It's like tenth of the level in men, but it's very important to have this 10% of testosterone for women, because if they
yes,
don't have it, they'll be very depressed, and probably there will be more transgender and lesbian,
yes,
also associated with serotonin. They are both regulated and synchronized according to solar patterns and energy levels.
yes. How do you think the lack of fathers in so many kids' lives affects their test? Is there any correlation with that in their testosterone levels or
Well, that's more behavioral psychology. I think
yeah?
I'm not really an expert on this kind of psychology, but I think it
Okay.
does because they tend to imitate their parents. So if they
Mhm.
don't have a masculine, role model, they will not be able to imitate this role model.
Most
In
certainly.
developmental psychology of children, they study, I think, about that. But of course, that's a very important factor as well, to have a father at home that provides a role model and plays with the kids. There's a rough and tumble play. Jordan Peterson has studied, I think, this aspect of
Yes.
children.
Yeah. One thing else I've long wondered about too is do you think there's a connection between abusive men in a mother's life and the daughters becoming lesbians because of that? And I use that theory with Lana Turner and her daughter because Lana Turner, while being very attractive, often would get with abusive men, and so much that one of her daughters actually killed one of the men, and then she was never interested in men. Do you think there's a connection between that by chance or not?
I think abuse can lower testosterone because it
Mm.
raises a stress response, and when you have high cortisol, high stress, you lower testosterone levels. So it can affect, yes, in developmental age
Yeah.
is very affected, the hormones, and the brain plasticity is very high in children until the brain matures at age, I think, 25 or something. So, of course, in this age, children are very susceptible to external environmental influences like high stress of abuse.
Yes. What so what made you want to go down this path of looking into testosterone levels versus, freedom and politics and how it's impacted politics?
Well, actually, I didn't know anything about hormones or even
No.
feminism back when I started my work in finance and economics. But I didn't understand. I saw the economics. I studied the Austrian School of Economics, which is more free market, pro-capitalism, libertarian, or objectivism. But I didn't understand what motivates the culture to self-destruct in this way that I was seeing, because they talk about economics, but I don't think that, as Ayn Rand says, economics doesn't motivate people. What motivates people are morals, like moral psychology and moral behavior. Everyone wants to be ethical according to his worldview, and that's so you have to dig deeper than economics. So I started looking what's going on, and then I found about testosterone and how it affects psychology, and I saw then homosexuality and feminism rising coincident with the rise of socialism and anti-capitalism. So I saw it's all connected, but I didn't find many theories about that, so I had to develop it on my own, which took me many years actually to study all this and then connect everything in the synthesis is about a decade of work of scientific investigation. But very strange to me that not many people are interested in this stuff, because I thought it
Yeah.
will be very important to connect the dots here
Yeah.
and integrate this. But people are more interested, in their daily life, I think.
Well, I think people, while money is also men are certainly motivated by money. They're also motivated by sex. I mean, you hear this story, oh, I wanted to become a rock and roll star so I could get laid, or sometimes I think Bill Clinton. That's the whole reason Bill Clinton got into politics. It was a way, or guys. I like working here because all the pretty girls that show up. It's there's definitely a motivation there. I don't know if and it probably
Actually, yeah, sure, of course. Sex hormones drive everything. It even drives your appetite because, like you see in masculine culture, like the cowboys, they used to be a herdsman. They eat a lot of meat, cow meat and stuff. Today,
yeah,
people are more feminine, so they're vegetarians. So they want to eat low fat diet, and because testosterone, sex hormones are made of fat, not
yes,
cholesterol.
yes,
So everything is interconnected, your diet, your sexual appetite. Even if you look at the Dark Ages, the Augustine doctrine of original sin, men, the ideal was to become a monk, to become celibate monks or nuns.
yes,
So, like today, we're seeing fertility rates collapsing. At some point, that may lead again to return to the age of monks and nuns, like in Buddhism, when you are celibate of sex and even don't, and vegetarianism,
yeah,
they don't eat meat. So it affects everything. Yes.
yeah. That's another interesting connection too, because one of the Kellogg brothers was an advocate of vegetarianism. Of course, he wanted to sell his cereal, but he also said, eating meat encourages, carnal pleasures. And I know the guy who invented graham crackers. His name was Graham. The same thing. He wanted to he wanted to discourage meat eating because, and if you look at the words carnivore and carnal, CARN, it looks like there might be a connection there. So I definitely noticed too that maybe there's how eating meat, or it seems like low testosterone, the rise. We have
Right.
vegetarianism and veganism among that.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at the Buddhism, it's very connected to mysticism, Eastern mysticism. out of body experience, the next world, out of this reality, and then they have to be monks and
Yeah.
focus on spirituality rather than the body, like this mind body dualism, Platonism. It rose during the rise of Buddhism in the 6th century BCE, and Pythagoras, who was the father of Platonism, actually visited India. Hinduism affected Buddhism, and it was brought into the West in the church, in the Augustine Catholicism, with this ideal of abstinence and celibacy, was influenced by Buddhism. And today with feminism, they love Buddhism, yoga, in academia now, Buddhism is very popular. So it's opposite like to the biblical God, the Father command of be fruitful and multiply and command over nature. Now it's the feminist Buddhist spirituality that is be submissive to nature. We are to be controlled by Mother Nature, so we have to lower our energy footprint. Don't breathe. Don't use the car. Don't drive. Don't release energy. Low energy state, low testosterone, low power, collapse of civilization, back to the primitive, what Ayn Rand called the anti-industrial revolution in her essay in 1971. So this is now all maturing into the collapse of the West, and you see, like in Europe now, they don't have even have energy or light for the winter or heating. They may freeze in the winter, and Putin plays on this with his gas wars and energy wars. So it's all playing out.
Yes, and the energy that it takes to create is often much more than the energy it takes to destroy. I mean, it takes a lot more work to
Right.
build a building than it does to tear it down. It seems as though low testosterone societies just are more destructive. Yeah, how do you think this plays out in politics? If have you looked into feminism and politics, and of course versus societies that are more gynocentrics and societies that are less gynocentric? You've definitely noticed a connection between that and socialism.
Yes, absolutely. Well, if you look at the work of biologist and ant researcher E.O. Wilson in Harvard, he talks about ant societies like it's called true sociality. That's like communism, like ants or bees or swabs. I think they're called swabs. They have this all women society, all female. In ants, there's the queen and their daughters, or all female. There are no males in the nest, and they all serve the queen. And if you look at communism, they call each comrade or brother. Yeah? It's all like one family. So it's like genetically related. So you have to be like this communist utopia is I think is based on feminism and castrating the man, like you see today in the transgendering. They want to castrate the man, have lower testosterone. Even if you look at the book published in 1931, a period of the Great Depression, is called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
Absolutely,
He
yes.
actually he talks about chemical castration of the population, so they will be more submissive and love their slavery. So it's
You-
similar to female ant nest where they serve the queen. And that's the basis of communism. And
It's
that's
easier
where we're
to
headed now, like Big Brother, all this surveillance state, the pandemic hysteria. It's all related to low energy.
yeah, it's easier to rule over low testosterone males. I mean, it's interesting that to look back at the flu pandemic of 1918, 1917. It was society was certainly much more masculine then, and they reacted much more rationally, whereas here there really wasn't much of anything, and yet everybody went nuts. Uh, it seemed to be very much I think a very weak response from a very weak society. Uh, is there a connection between gynocentrism and socialism in your view, or anything like that? It seems like there is, because the socialists certainly promoted feminism and wanted women to vote.
Yes, of course. As I described now this connection discussed by the father of sociobiology, is Harvard professor E.O. Wilson. He researched ants and other insects, social insects like bees and ants. They're all female societies controlled by a queen. So it's similar, you can say, to Hillary Clinton, which is the queen of the females, and they're all hang around her and they hate the man. So now you can see it manifesting itself in against Putin or Trump. Like they hate the feminists on the Democratic Party. They hate Putin and Trump, so they send the FBI after Trump, and they want to regime change now in Russia to dethrone Putin, and so have this new world order of feminism and socialism, and Putin is in their way. It's more like, in apes, you can see the difference between bonobo and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees is a more masculine society where there's alpha male dominant. And bonobo, which are both chimpanzees are bonobos are our close relatives to humans, like 98 point something similar DNA. But in the bonobos, which are less known about, but there are also apes that resemble humans in social activity. It's a more lesbian feminist society, matriarchal, in which the females dominate and they have more lesbian sex. So if you look at like the West now is more like bonobos, and Russia in the East is more like chimpanzees. So there's a social war here between the social structure based on sex hormones who will control the world. The bonobo, feminist, lesbian in the West, or the chimpanzee structure of Putin and the masculine East. And I think it will lead to a global war. We're entering now World War III. Now it's like in the 1930s, we had starting in the Depression in 1934, there was the civil war in Spain between the communists and the fascists in Spain. It's now in Ukraine is a sort of a proxy civil war between Russia and Ukraine. They are very closely related, but they hate each other now. And Ukraine is supported by like the liberal West. So it's the same was then in Spain in 1934. Like the Nazis supported the fascists in Ukraine, and Stalin supported the communists in Spain, and they were fighting against each other until the fascists won in Spain under I forgot the leader,
Francisco Franco.
Yeah. So we are the same now. Like in the 1930s, leading to World War II. It was in 1939 began. So I think World War III will start about 2027, something like that, like 5 years away.
Some would say that it's already starting now. It also seems that one of the major differences between the communists, Marxists, and the fascists or the Nazis, or is that Hitler, Mussolini, Franco generally embraced traditional gender roles, whereas all the communists rejected those traditional gender roles. I mean,
there was a wave of homosexuality primarily in Weimar Germany. Like the founder of the Nazi Party was a homosexual. Ernst Röhm was a gay fascist, pedophile. He used the German youth movement to recruit gay pedophiles to the brown shirts. And Hitler had only one testicle. That was published in many science journals as well. So he was like castrated. He couldn't have children, Hitler.
But there was still an attitude that they didn't really want they wanted women to have kids and raise kids instead of be out in the factories. That was the ambition.
Yeah, because if you look then, the testosterone levels then were much higher than today. Even those controlled society like fascist society were homosexual, not lesbians. Today is lesbians control or feminists control the world. It's like a fourth wave feminism now. Back then it was only first wave feminism. It was only starting in feminist movement only started in the 1920s leading in Germany, Weimar Germany, 1919 was the first nation to allow women to vote. I think it's called suffrage, women's suffrage, voting rights for
women's
women.
suffrage. Yeah, that was 1919 in Germany.
In Germany, following later by in the United States. Yes, in Switzerland, women were only allowed to vote in 1971.
Yes, Switzerland was a very late adapter, and do you
And that's
think?
why it's the most capitalist country, because it's very masculine culture. Also, the origin of Calvinism, Calvinist Reformation, which was which is a pro-capitalist in more system, was started in Geneva, in Switzerland, by a French priest, Calvin. So it's a more masculine society, Switzerland, I think. That's why it's very capitalist and rich.
Yes, Switzerland's still very Calvinist. Yes, I knew. At least that's what I've heard from people. But yes, so you definitely think there's a correlation between, or maybe a correlation or a cause that that women's suffrage leads to socialism. Does that necessarily have to be the case, or is that?
Yes, because what socialism is about a zero-sum game, as the like Yaron Brook, the objectivist philosopher, likes to say. It's a war for a class war, or we have Nazism is a race war, and you have sex wars. It's all about distribution of wealth, because what they say is we have limited amount of resources, of energy. Of the green movement, we say we don't have resources, we don't have energy, and now we have to fight about what we have, and we fight to death, and so you split into a few groups, and each group, like now we have Russia against Ukraine, against the West, or then it was Nazis against communists, or the communist class warfare. So they fight each other for the cake, how to distribute the wealth. They don't believe they can increase the wealth, because they believe there is not enough wealth, and you cannot work to create wealth because you don't have the resources. So you have it's not a win-win situation, it's a zero-sum game. That's socialism about. The contrast to that is capitalism, when we say, okay, we can grow up the cake. We don't need to fight about it. We have a lot of resources. We can build, we can create, like the Enlightenment worldview, the masculine worldview of the founding fathers. We need liberty in order to be creators, producers, science, industry, all that, liberty. But now we have the opposite, because we have low energy, solar energy. So we have pandemic, we have plagues, we have war, we're going back to the Middle Ages now, like in the series Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones. That's what we have now. Game of Thrones, and winter is starting. In Game of Thrones, they say winter is coming. Well, if you look in the 14th century, before the Black Plague and this area also of the Mongol invasions into Europe, the Mongols conquered a huge empire, uniting Russia, China, and Iran. Similar to today, you have China, Russia, and Iran against the West. So then Dante published the Inferno about in this period, in 1312, I think he published, before the break of the pandemic of the Black Plague, the Inferno, which is very, a dark view of hell and purgatory and all that. Then it was associated with Christianity of the Middle Ages. So popular culture precedes the actual catastrophe that's coming, and you can see it in the like popular series like the Game of Thrones. I mean, that's talking about winter is coming, and that's a better predictor than science, academia, because academia, they still believe in this. They hate men, so the feminists say man-made global warming. Why is it man-made? Because they hate men, so everything bad is man-made global warming. It's not caused by the sun or cosmic and solar conditions. Everything is bad is caused by man, so it must be man-made global warming. And they claim that the sun does not affect climate, which is a total joke. I mean, this is not even cannot even be considered science. But this is what we have today in academia. So civilization is now in process of collapsing into dark age.
Yes, with the help of academia. And of course, I don't know how academia expects to survive without a civilization, but it is interesting. But have you noticed anything about people who go into academia who definitely tend to be much more socialist and much more destructive than the average person on the street who tends to be still somewhat sane?
Yes, yes. I think, well, you see, women today do much better in academia than men. Men are falling apart. So they control the academia. So if you don't agree with their views, you will not be promoted. And environment is feminist. Now this is a radical feminism. If you look before that, there were advantages in feminism. I mean, that led to the development of Darwinism, evolutionary worldview, which contradicted the Newtonian worldview of creation by God. So when there is some decline in testosterone, you can still have progress in science and civilization, like evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology. There is a lot of progress still going on. But when you hit a certain threshold of a low, then you get into a really bad period of total war and destruction, as happened in the 1930s or in the Middle Ages, in the period of the Mongol invasions or similar catastrophes. So we are now heading into this period of crossing the threshold into a collapse of testosterone levels from a hormonal endocrinology perspective. And this is the catastrophic period of the winter. This was also written by a German historian, Oskar Spengler, in 1918. He published The Decline of the West, in which he discerned it very well. He said the winter is coming. Even in his book, he understood the seasonal patterns, which we much less understand today, I think. How the
Yes.
seasonal patterns of civilization, how they're affected by the environment and like this, we need this homeostasis, environmental homeostasis, like our body requires a certain temperature, like I know in Celsius it's like 37 degrees Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit, I think. So we need for the metabolism to work and the biochemical reactions that make us alive. We need a certain homeostasis, a certain balance of hormones, of temperature, of food, and like we have insulin balance, testosterone we balance with the stress hormones. So our society is now out of balance. We crossed this threshold of low sex and growth hormones. We have very high stress hormones now. People are going insane. Like you see now, Kanye West is going crazy with anti-Semitic slurs and this gender wars. All society is breaking apart in this dark winter period. And you got these global wars now for empire, West versus East. You have in the West also this New World Order, UN empire with Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab. They want a global reset, destroy capitalism. They're not much better than the East. Even I would think they're even worse than Putin, because Putin is at least Christian. He doesn't want to destroy humanity. He wants to conquer humanity, maybe enslave some, but it's not like this radical green people want to population reduction, which is what the Nazis want. In the 1935, they were the first environmentalist was Hitler. He passed the environmental laws in 1935. So I don't see any beneficial trends here. We have to wait till this plays out, but it will take many decades till we reach bottom.
So you don't think we've reached the bottom yet?
No, I think the bottom will be about 2070, is about 50 years away, because if you look at the 7th century cycle, the Black Plague erupted in 1347. In 1312, Dante published the Inferno. So if you look at the similar patterns here, the Mongol invasion of Kiev, Russian Kiev, was in 1240. Take 7th century later, 1941, the Nazis invaded Kiev. And now we have Putin invading Kiev. The Mongol invasion had control of Russia for centuries. I mean, the Russian rebelled, but they only succeeded repelling the Mongols in like 1500 after the Renaissance. So these patterns play out over decades and centuries, and I think we're going a very, very dangerous period now.
Yes. Where do you think Latin America and Mexico and Africa will play a part in all this, or will they just be non-factors?
Well, in Brazil and Latin America, there's a lot of evangelical now rising, which is very good, I think, because if you look at the Protestant Reformation, it's more evangelical rather than the Catholics. They brought the rise of the modern Western civilization with their more individualistic view and high fertility since the Reformation. Like Martin Luther was a Catholic monk before he became he started the Reformation, and then
Yes.
he married a nun and had a family of 5 children. So that's high fertility rates, and that led to the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment. So I see some forces working for progress in Latin America, but I don't think they will play out anytime soon because there are counter forces of communism in Latin America as well.
Yes.
So there's a huge battle there, and I don't think in a period of low testosterone the progress can be made. What we can
Right.
hope is not to reach not a total breakdown of civilization.
Yeah. Well, I see Latin America as a place where they still take family seriously, where marriage, they don't have a divorce culture, but maybe they're kind of like where America was in 1950 or something like that. They, at least as far as, so they still have time to maybe keep the genie from going out of the bottle, but it's hard to say. I hear similar things about say the former Warsaw Pact countries, which, as one person corrected me, they called themselves Central Europe, uh, because they had a lot of this communism forced down their throats, and now they say, well, we don't want that. So I don't know. Where do you think there is hope, or do you think there is any hope?
Well, I think there's also always some bastions of hope, but for them to play out, we need rising testosterone levels and rising solar activity that will trigger this flourishing. Is similar to a tree growing again. So you need this is synchronized with serotonin, with the light from the sun, and so we need the summer to come again. So I don't see a hope for growth patterns now, but what we can hope, I think, and try to maybe achieve is not total collapse of civilization. We need some pockets that will remain. Like in the Middle Ages, you still have the Roman Empire fell in the Dark Ages, but then you have the Byzantine Empire remaining in the East, which is now in Turkey, but then it was called the Byzantine Empire. After that, it was replaced by the Muslim Caliphate. So there's always pockets that will remain that are more masculine, like the Byzantine Empire was more masculine than the Western Empire in Rome, which collapsed. So maybe Eastern Europe will be more. It's difficult to say, but it looks to me that the East as a whole is much more strong today than the West. If you look at the West is collapsing because of feminist, the debt bubble, the empire, inflation, debt, low energy, the self-destructing like Biden is doing it on steroids. In 2 years, he's totally destroyed the world. It's amazing. I mean, he opened so many wars, inflation, open borders, all this in just 2 years. So I think in 2 years the West can collapse, in the next 2 years because now we have high inflation. The U.S. is looking more like Turkey now in inflation-wise, and the bond market in the U.S. is now collapsing. So the Fed will have to print money very soon in order to save the bond market, which now happened in Britain. In Britain, the bond market started to collapse. They started to print money again. So now they will probably do the same in the U.S., and that means high inflation. Inflation is just starting. So that will be like civilization in collapse. Even over the next 2 years, we can collapse.
It's possible. I mean, a lot of people have been predicting the collapse for a long time, but I definitely do not think America would ever be able to fight a full-scale war like America fought back in the 1940s. I don't think America could come close to doing that right now.
It looks like the great danger is the nuclear war, because World War III will 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 be nuclear, because I don't see anyone holding back. Even now, you see the atrocious war in Ukraine. It's terrible, and it's just beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to try to mitigate the disaster, try to avoid the conflict from escalating. But feminists, radical feminists, are going crazy with their hatred of Putin and Trump. And Trump, I think,
Yeah.
can stop this escalation. He can make peace with Putin. I mean, when Trump was in office, we had four Abraham Accords in Israel. We had four peace accords with Arab nations here, which is amazing. And there was no major war in the world. Unfortunately, he fell, and now we have Biden and this radical, crazy feminist regime, which doesn't want to have any dialogue with Putin, and escalating intentionally, I think. So I don't see any good outcome coming soon.
What would you tell let's say a single male living in America, say 23 or 24, what would you, or anywhere, what would you tell them to do nowadays? I mean, to stay in America or go somewhere else, or
Well,
what?
I don't think the problem is with staying in America. I think what you need to do is become self-independent economically and financially. Maybe move to an agricultural community of conservative, like in Texas. You have a lot of rural areas, because, like, when the cities collapse, civilization collapse. Like, if you look at the Dark Age, so you can still thrive if you have a strong agricultural community, because the supply chains will collapse. We already seen that with the pandemic,
Yes.
collapsing supply chains. So where you are in a city, you need a lot of energy and to keep the supply
Mhm.
chain running. So if your energy infrastructure is collapsing, you're not going to get food in the cities, even if you don't have war.
Exactly.
So you need to go back to the roots, to agriculture, to strong masculine rural activity. I think that will be the way of the future.
Yeah, and it's funny how those more traditional gender roles just arise out of that, it seems. But anyway,
Right. Yeah, that's the life cycle of civilization playing out here.
yeah, when you talk about the cycles, are you aware of the Strauss-Howe generational theories?
Yes, actually, I read his book. I think it's very influenced my thinking. I wrote a chapter about intergenerational phases. Like, you see more masculine, older grandparents than the parents. I see it in my family. It might become much more liberal each generation because of the collapsing testosterone levels. So I think also it has to do with solar cycles, because, like, generation is like 22-year cycle a generation, and if you look at the solar cycle, every 22 years the north and the south pole of the sun flips. The magnetic fields of the sun flips every 22 years,
Mhm.
and 3 generations of 22 is like 66 years. About 70 years is the human sexual reproductive life cycle. Is 3 generations.
Mhm.
I'm very interested in how it all works.
Yep. I'm curious. Yeah. So this is interesting. What do you think there are any other ways to live in modern society, or should a man just should he try to get married, or should he just maybe, or should we all just give up, or I mean, what else should we do nowadays?
But I don't think you need to give up. I think you have to be adapt. That's evolutionary adaptation to changing environmental condition. So you can still thrive in conditions even of the collapse of the cities will collapse. But if you have an agricultural community with conservative values, like you have many Christian communities in the US, in the evangelical, in the Bible Belt, in Texas, you can be successful in farming in other areas. But I think some communities can will thrive even if some parts of civilization collapse. Even if you look at the collapse of Roman Empire, in the Byzantine Empire, things were going better during this period, even if it wasn't as good as today, because
Yes.
of course we will not reach this height for a long time that we reached in this period at the peak. But some people will thrive in any conditions if they know how to adapt to the circumstances. And I think the agricultural areas can thrive enormously if you're into natural resources, agriculture,
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I wonder. So how do you think we will have a war soon? And what do you think that war, that major World War III, will look like? Who exactly against whom?
Well, I think it's the same as the Mongol Empire. We are a 7th century cycle here. There was in the 14th, 13th
Mm,
century the Mongol Empire rising, starting with Genghis Khan in 1200s, and he united, conquered, killed a lot of people. I mean, it was worse than Hitler. How many people he killed? So he united China, Russia, and Iran, and then was Persian territory, and he
yes.
conquered much of the Islamic civilization. He reached Baghdad. He burned their libraries. He was it's not I don't know if it was him, but it was his predecessor.
Yeah.
So they killed a lot of people, but they made a great empire. I mean, that's where we're going again, because what's happening with the sex is a more imperial decline of individualism, of independent states. We see it also in the West with this new world order, United Nations. They want a global empire, and the East they want a global empire. So now they're clashing of civilizations between the West and the East, and it's going to explode into a global war. I think actually the East will be very strong here, but the problem is we have nuclear weapons today, so it will be very easy to annihilate the big cities. That's the
Yes.
that will be the big problem. I think you have to go out of the big cities back to the simple life, the primitive agricultural life, because the complex societies, when they collapse, the high energy uh, metropolitan areas will collapse first.
Yes. That's very interesting. It's going to be. We'll see what happens there. Uh,
It's similar if you look at human aging, sexual reproductive life cycle. When it ends, older people get more cancer. Now, if you look at cancer cells, it's actually a degeneration back to a primitive form of cell. There is a professor of physics in Arizona University studied this. He proposed this theory. So what's going on is the cancer cell has, because people do age, they'll have low testosterone, lower energy in your cell. And the cell is like a battery, it works on energy. So if you have a low voltage in the cell, like a normal cell needs like more than 100 millivolts of potential electric energy between. That's why we have the membrane of the cell. So we have the plus and the negative uh, outside of the cell rather than inside the cell. And that causes the oxygen to go into the cell to the mitochondria to create the energy.
yes.
So a normal cell creates 38 ATPs, which are units of energy, but a cancer cell doesn't use oxygen. It only uses fermentation of sugar. So it lives on sugar. It only requires 2 ATP, 5% of a normal cell. So
Yeah.
when your energy level collapses in the cell, your cell becomes cancerous. It reverts to a primitive form of life that was before, like 2 billion years ago. Before 2 billion years ago was the great oxidation event of the Earth, which led to the rise of oxygen levels, which enabled later in the Cambrian explosion the rise of complex multicellular life. Like we are a complex multicellular organism. But when energy levels collapse, you revert back to this primitive, like a single cellular form of the cancer cell.
Mhm.
So that's what's going on with our society, is a complex system that is collapsing because of low energy state, low testosterone, because of the adverse environmental conditions now and pandemics and stuff. So, and the immune response causes hysteria and low energy levels. We're collapsing back to the primitive. So our energy uses footprint is decreasing. So the big cities will collapse because they need a lot of energy to sustain a big city, and all this division of labor of a capitalist global economy needs a lot of energy for transport, for supply chains, everything. So when you collapse back to the primitive, like a single cellular organism, you need much less energy, like 5% of the energy, like in primitive societies today in Africa or in third world countries. They don't require much energy. So that's what's happening in the degeneration phase
Yes,
of the social collapse.
but
It's
also,
like the aging of civilization.
of course, in the primitive societies, they have a life expectancy that is much lower. I mean,
Absolutely, yes.
yeah. Where do you think uh, I don't know how well traveled you are, but where do you think in the world today that the dynamic between men and women is healthy, where they have a healthy dating culture and or a healthy marriage culture where things are where that people get married, stay married, and
I think there are still conservative societies. Even in the US, you have conservatives that are more pro family and pro marriage. In Israel, you have the Orthodox or religious Jews that are very pro family and conservative. Um, so you can still find communities, I think, like this in the US, in Israel, in other places, but they are becoming harder to find because as testosterone level and masculinity and sexual attraction and heterosexuality collapse, this will not be the norm. Like if you look at Islamic
yes,
Caliphate, like in Ottoman Empire, the Sultan had like is more centralized system when the Sultan had like hundreds of wives and concubines, and he had eunuchs, castrated men working for him, serving him. Like in China, you have this system. It's more like an ant nest where the
yeah.
female workers serve the queen.
It's sometimes said though in societies like that where you have less men reproducing, that keeps the testosterone levels high. Whereas if where you know whereas where things are more monogamous, low testosterone gets passed on along with high testosterone. Do you think that's makes a difference, or do you think this is another cycle? Or
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's very complex. Sexual
yeah,
reproductive evolutionary strategies are very complex. So testosterone levels are very high, reached very high levels in the West during the Enlightenment. But if you look in Africa, they have very high testosterone in Africa,
yes,
the black population. So we have like a reserve because I think that because they live in hot areas that are more like near the equator, like tropical areas.
yeah,
So they're less influenced by low solar activity over there.
yes,
So I think what's happening, if you look at the Homo sapiens, they came from Africa to Europe, and then they mixed with the Neanderthals in Europe.
yes,
I think the Neanderthals was, it might be a cycle similar to today when you see the black from Africa coming to Europe and mixing there with the population there. So they can raise the testosterone, I think, because now the blacks are more dominant. They have higher testosterone. When during the Enlightenments, the whites in Africa, in Europe, were more dominant. So it became the British Empire, the French Empire colonized Africa. Now it's the opposite. Africa is colonizing Europe because the testosterone level changed. So you see all these sex and gender wars with the blacks and the whites, and Kanye West is now becoming anti-Semitic, and there's this whole conflicts coming up when you have the testosterone levels falling. It causes a lot of mayhem and conflict and war.
Some are saying that China's also colonizing Africa, though, too. It seems like they're going in everywhere, but uh, that's
Yes,
interesting.
yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if they will be so successful because their population is collapsing now. So in decades of two away, there will be much less Chinese people. But
Yeah.
let's see.
How do you explain it when a society is somewhat open with regard to women's rights and then goes back very quickly? I mean, let's take, Afghanistan in the 1970s. You can see pictures of women, they look like women in Europe or women in America. And then the Taliban takes over and they just and then women are, covered and set back 500 years. What is that? Is that high testosterone or is that low testosterone?
There was low testosterone in the 1970s. Actually, the collapse then because there was like a dark winter period. There's global cooling. There was actually a hysteria about global cooling in the 1970s.
Yes, there was.
So then you had the one-child policy in China, which caused population reduction in China,
Yes.
and then it caused also the Islamic and the revolution in Iran and Afghanistan, both of them, which caused the jihad from Iran and Afghanistan today, and the Taliban. So that's low testosterone because what they want is submission, and submission is low testosterone. They don't want liberty. The forces of liberty are forces of enlightenment of high testosterone. It's cyclical.
Yes.
So, and if you look at the birth rates in Iran are now collapsing. They have a very low birth rate
Yes.
in Iran and Turkey, I think similar to Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, seeing what's happened with some of the feminism in Iran. But, and you mentioned the Muslim caliphate. I mean, it's often forgotten too that the Muslim, back in that era, around Baghdad, that was very much a center of science and discovery. I mean, they had some wonderful mathematicians coming out of the Muslim world at that time. I mean, the word algebra comes from Arabic, for example, and we use Arabic numerals.
Right, it's the golden age of Islam, like from the 8th century to the 12th century, I think, like 400 years. Is similar to the European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. But then they collapsed with anti-reason and anti-fertility.
Yes.
They had a philosopher, Al-Ghazali, in the 12th century. He wrote a book against the philosophers, against Aristotelianism. He
Yeah.
became a mystic. He withdrew himself, similar to Buddhism. He withdrew himself to the desert and became like a spiritual, yoga, the same like we have today with the feminist and spiritualism that's anti this world. And then Islam collapsed and they were conquered by the Mongols, and Baghdad was destroyed. Her libraries were burned by the Mongols barbarian invasions.
Yes.
So that looks like what's going on with Europe today. The Muslims are coming, the barbarians are coming into Europe. They'll destroy Europe from within, I think. But then when solar cycles rise again, a new civilization will probably rise over the next few centuries afterwards. So that's the life cycles, the 7th century life cycle of civilization, repeating through history.
And you look also at the lack of scientific achievement the lack of scientific achievement in that part of the world. It seems as though the high testosterone societies lead to more scientific achievement, and more scientific achievement also is also a product of taking risks and trying new things. And if people are high testosterone, they tend to be willing to try new things.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what you see the age of exploration in the Renaissance.
Yes.
There's also higher birth rates, and the Reformation. The priests became married and renounced their celibacy.
Yeah.
And then that was in Islam too. They had the golden age. Then Europe had its old golden age, and that's the cycle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mentioned this. Do you think also how much do you think the Aristotelianism versus Platonism though impacts societies? I mean, many will say that that the Protestant Reformation was rejection of Aristotle in favor of Plato?
I think the Protestantism actually led to the Enlightenment, which more Aristotelian, the Enlightenment, because if you look at John Locke and Newton, they were more Aristotelian. Plato was out of this world, is more similar to Pythagorean Buddhism, like mysticism, Platonism. And Platonism was also associated more with homosexuality in Greece. If you look at his later book, he denounced homosexuality in his first book. It's called The Symposium. Is pro pedophilia and homosexuality because that's the way they taught the young kids. Like pedo was the instructor. And if you look at his later book, The Laws, which was published I think in 340 BC, he was anti, I think, homosexuality. He was more pro laws and order, similar to the biblical laws of Moses or something like that. And then it was Aristotle came, which was pro logic and reason in this world rather than the other world. Ayn Rand discusses this dichotomy in philosophy. So I think what you have is this otherworldly view, which Ayn Rand rejects, is low testosterone. Because when you have low testosterone, low energy, this world looks bad. You're depressed, like a Great Depression period. So you look to escape from reality. And also in Christianity, you have this escapism with an afterlife. Like afterlife will be good because in Augustinian doctrine of original sin, this world is evil. It's like a dualist view of the world. While the Enlightenment world believes this world is good because God created a good world for people, for humans to live and enjoy, be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. Do you think any religions are necessarily are the product of low testosterone or high testosterone? You seem to think.
Right, sure, yeah. Like if you look at Ayn Rand, she called Buddhism like primitive ancient religion or something.
Yes.
She was Zen Buddhism, all these freaks, the hippies in the 1960s, she hated this because it looked primitive to her. And her view is high testosterone is more Aristotelian logic.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But she was also like anti-God, but she didn't understand that actually God of order is the view of logic of in the New Testament. Jesus associated with the logos, with order and logic.
Yes.
So I think she was mistaken in this view because I think there's a problem in the 1950s. Testosterone was rising, but it wasn't rising enough as in the Enlightenment. So what happened is that Ayn Rand was a woman, and she was very rational and logical, but she couldn't. A woman also cannot, as she said herself, cannot lead men. She said like a woman in the 1970s cannot be president because she cannot lead men in the military. So objectivism as a problem because she tried to lead the man into this pro-individualist worldview, but she didn't make enough. She didn't have enough sexual testosterone energy for that because soon after solar activity in the 60s began to fall. So feminism took over again and socialism.
Yeah. What do you think about some of the gurus that men are flocking to nowadays? I mean, Jordan Peterson probably being the most famous, but also Rollo Tomasi, Andrew Tate, or somebody else like that. What's your take on all that?
Well, the only one I like is Jordan Peterson because he's deeply intellectual. I'm interested more in intellectual stuff. Rollo Tomasi, I think, is a nice, interesting guy, but I don't see any enlightenment coming from him. I mean, he just hates women. Okay, that's great, but what you do about that, I don't see.
Rollo has been married for about 25 years and has a daughter. I don't think he hates women, but
okay, so hates feminists. Okay, but I don't see him like bringing in like an enlightenment vision to humanity. I mean, Jordan Peterson, I think, is very deep intellectual. I'm more interested in his work. Although he's a bit depressed, I mean, he has some genetic, I think, epigenetic problem with serotonin.
Yeah.
So he's parents were also suffering from this, and his daughter suffering from this depression, which is
Uh,
very
yeah.
unfortunate.
I appreciate, maybe other people appreciate, that Jordan's not really tried to hide his flaws. I mean, he did disappear for a little while, but he's not lying about it. I mean, he's coming out and saying, "Hey, I've got problems, but I'm going to face them." And
Yeah, yeah. I think he still has some dark view because,
yeah,
like, I like to listen to sometimes Yaron Brook, the
yeah,
objectivist philosopher. So he says he's pretty gloomy, like with his
yeah,
Christian worldview. Jordan Peterson, like he said, the world is basically bad, and you have to accept it and try to do good. Yes, but the world is more like Augustine view. It's not like
yeah,
Enlightenment view. He say the world is how Ayn Rand called it, benevolent universe view. He doesn't think the universe is benevolent to humans. So he has like this depressed view and this pretty depressed personality, but he still has, I think he's a mix of high testosterone and low serotonin or something. Because he's
yeah.
not like fully optimistic, but there is a very strong optimist part to him. So it's interesting to
Yes,
analyze his hormonal structure.
it is interesting though too, though, because I've noticed there's a lot of people out there who raise their kids pretty conservatively, but then they have kids who completely go the other way. It's
Yeah, it's difficult to be a
yeah,
conservative in today's culture. It looks
yeah,
like we're going to have conservatives, I think, mostly in the rural communities when you
yes.
need strong men.
And I don't know how, if men want to necessarily, still get married, because it still can be very much a gamble for them, you know.
Yeah, well, I think what will happen probably is that the civilization will collapse. People will return to the primitive, agricultural life, and then strong men will be appreciated again
Yeah. So
by society.
you think we might just deindustrialize then, or do you?
Yes, to a large extent. I don't think we'll completely go back to the
Mhm.
dark age. There's always progress in the long run. There's this developmental cycles, so we will remain.
Yeah.
We will not be completely primitive, but we will need strong men to continue civilization, like build farms, build communities again. So this is the natural cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. I just wonder how far back we'll go. I mean, maybe we'll go back to something 20 years. I don't know if the hyper connected society we live in is necessarily helping us. I mean,
No, I think we're going to go back pretty far because if you look what's going on, like in Ukraine now, it's getting totally destroyed, and that's bad. And I think it'll be similar in all
mhm.
over the world because with the weapons we have now, I mean that's scary because
It is scary. Yeah.
and the Russians, what you see what they're doing now, they're destroying the electricity, the power infrastructure in Ukraine and in Europe by
Well,
not providing energy.
yeah. And it's going to be a very cold winter. You know, I, this is like unrelated question, but it's something I've just been dying to ask you for a while. What do you think about Bitcoin?
I think it's part of the degeneration. I'm studying now physics. I'm writing a new article about started writing a new article about entropy and social entropy. I'm interested about social physics. How are
Mhm.
like if you know this complex science of complex systems. So what we see is now that society is degenerating. People are worshiping like in physics. They believe in entropy. They believe the universe is going to end in entropy, like the second law of thermodynamics. Everything is going to degenerate. I don't agree with that. I think it's caused by actual low testosterone and people are very doomed. So I think a manifestation of entropy is transgenderism when instead of having a binary two-sex system, male female, you have like 300 sexes now. That's entropy because entropy is chaos. Is when you degenerate, as Jordan Peterson says, masculine order to degenerate into feminine chaos.
Yeah.
So in finance, you see the entropy in Bitcoin, like you have 15,000 cryptocurrencies now. Most of them are frauds and they're collapsing. That's entropy. That's social entropy because when you have one real currency, gold and silver, like two of them. They are real assets made of physical elements. And so crypto is like Buddhism. It's something, I know, it's like energy, spiritual. It doesn't exist. So if we are out of energy, as now the radical feminist, the green movement wants, there will be no light, no electricity, there will be no cryptos. It's going to disappear.
Yeah.
We
Are
are
there?
now living in a period like the Tower of Babel is collapsing, so
Yeah.
it's interesting that you see the cities collapse. So the goal in 9/11 of the Islamic jihadists was to destroy the towers in New York City. That it's like in sex, you have this erection, masculine erection, and then it collapses. So it's the
Yeah.
same. So it's
That's
the
yeah.
erection
Yeah.
of the buildings.
Yes, that is like yes. We'll erect the tall buildings. Yes, there is definitely a connection between the tall buildings going into the sky. But 9/11. I think Bin Laden's goal really was to bait the U.S. to get into wars that they couldn't win, and he was right on that note. I mean, as my friend Scott Horton once said, Afghanistan is where empires go to die, and that goes all the way back to Alexander. You know, but
Yeah, I think empires tend to die pretty
yeah,
fast because they overextend the resources. Yeah.
yeah, they overextend their resources, and I mean, and there is an overextension. I mean, there's no reason really for anybody to eat food that comes from more than 100 miles away. I mean, unless you're living in a place where you just can't get food. I mean, there's plenty of food. It's easy to grow food in a lot of places in the world, so and there's no
Now,
reason.
now, now in the interconnected world we have,
Yeah,
like Egypt is dependent, like 40% of its wheat is coming from
yeah,
Russia, I think, or something. So it'll be a catastrophe if we don't have the supply chains going
yeah.
on.
Well, I mean, Egypt is largely a desert except for the Nile River, though.
Yeah, but yeah, they have huge population explosion there.
Yeah,
The people are very poor, and well, it's going to be a huge problems when
yeah,
civilization collapses because people
yes,
are dependent on the supply
yeah.
chains.
But I mean, why? But why? Why do we have us? Let's say I live 5 miles from the apple orchard. The guy picks his apples, and then he sends them to some centralized warehouse 500 miles away, and then the apples get sent back to me. I mean, why don't I just go to him and get the apples? It makes a lot more sense. And it's not like food lasts. I mean, food is a perishable item. You gotta eat it quick, or and of course the longer those apples sit around, the less nutritious they are.
Right. Yeah. Well, population density in big cities
Yeah.
requires the supply chains, but it
Mhm.
has huge advantages because you get the division of labor and all this culture and science universities.
Hmm.
There's a very interesting, I think, work about that done in the Santa Fe Institute of Complex Systems. They study complex societies. There's a book published about this. I forgot the name. Scaling of complex societies in. So they study in big cities how much energy they consume, and they found out even that people walk faster in big cities. Everything is going faster. It requires more energy. So it's very interesting how it works. Like our body, if you compare it to a single cell like cancer, it requires very low energy. But complex systems like our body requires 20 times more energy than a cancer cell, which is a ancient
Yes.
form of primitive life. So it's the same like a big city requires enormous energy, like 20, 40 times the times of energy to work than a village. The scaling laws are very interesting there. That has to do, I think, also with the human sexual reproductive life cycle. Now, theories of aging. I'm very interested in how it works with bioenergetics, how much energy we need, and how it manifests itself in the life cycles even of civilizations. Because, as you know, big cities like Rome had a population of 1 million people, and when it collapsed into a population of only 10,000 people a century later. So it's quite amazing how it collapsed catastrophic can be when system declines.
Yes, it can. I wonder if we might see another population decline in the future as well, and certainly even with the low birth rates in Europe. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Well, this is. Are there any other gurus that you'd recommend reading on topics like this, or any other authors or podcasts or resources? Obviously, your own
Uh,
books.
well, it depends. I'm more interested in science, but it depends what you're interested in. I personally I like Jordan Peterson. I like he's very intellectual. I like
Yes.
Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is also a
Yeah.
independent thinker. He's not like a radical liberal. So in
Yeah.
academia,
Jonathan Haidt. Yeah.
and Steven Pinker has some interesting books. But it's very broad subject, so I don't know. Each person has his own interests, so
Yeah.
tend to focus on a particular area.
I just thought, what do you think of Camille Paglia?
Oh, I love her work. I read her book. I forgot its name.
Sex, Art, and American Culture, Sexual Persona.
Sexual Persona. Yeah, it's a classic, and she's very bright, and she actually studied very deep thinker. She studied, as an art historian, ancient Greek and Roman cultures, even Egyptian culture. So she stated that she found out that when transgenderism comes, it's always before the collapse of civilization. She talked about it like 7 years ago, or 5 years ago, I think. So her predictions are coming true in
Yes,
our
they.
time.
Yeah, well, this has certainly been an enlightening conversation. What do you else? Anything else you want to say before we go?
Well, I still hope. I was trying to, wake up some intellectual debate regarding sex, hormones, and civilization. I did do some. I published a few articles in academic science
Yeah,
journals. Some professors read my work. The general public, I think, is too difficult for them because it requires a lot of
yeah,
study in these areas. So, but I'm still hopeful that academia now they're reading my articles, considering for a science journal in the U.S. So maybe we can do something to save civilization before it
hopefully.
collapses. Hopefully, yeah.
That that assumes that academia is honest enough to publish it. Well, yeah,
Well, I
um,
think now they're very scared of Putin, so
yeah.
maybe they will publish
Well,
it. I don't know.
it
I don't think
seems
so.
like as Michael Malice said, the left always has to be in a state of cataplexy about something, whether it be Trump, coronavirus, Putin, or whatever. They need something to be worried about. I don't know if that's a low T.
Yeah,
Where can people find you? Where should people look for you?
I have the website testosteronecivilization.com. One word,
TestosteroneCivilization.com. Okay.
testosteronecivilization.com. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And yes, I'm Chris Baker. You can find me at chrisbaker.net and my novel on Amazon, Escape from the Village. And this is my podcast. So, and of course, the Fountainhead Forum on YouTube and other platforms. So, this has been a great talk, Roy. I've enjoyed having you, and thank you very much. And we are signing off. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.